Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Disaster Resilience, Preparation, Mitigation, and Recovery, hosted by the National Housing Conference and sponsored by our friends at NeighborWorks America. My name is Brittany Webb, and I'm the Director of Research for NHC. I've been fortunate to be able to work with NeighborWorks on developing this series, highlighting important topics in the housing policy world. Thank you to them for making this series possible. This is the sixth webinar in our series, and today we will be discussing the impact of natural disasters on communities and what we can do to better prepare and support victims of disasters and severe weather events. This topic is incredibly important and unfortunately becoming more relevant each year as climate change continues to spur more frequent and more intense weather events. For many of us in the housing world, dealing with natural disasters used to largely be a matter of response and rebuilding efforts. Today, we know that response alone isn't enough. Resiliency and planning have become commonplace concerns for home builders and communities alike. Many of you attending this webinar likely saw the 2021 report from CoreLogic showing that natural disasters impacted 1 in 10 homes in 2021. That same report found that disasters caused $56.92 billion in property damage from major events in 2021. These statistics are sobering. We also know that disaster recovery is too often not equitable. Communities that are already suffering from disinvestment can be left behind without the proper resources to move forward with their recovery. This leads to further exacerbation of disparities that we all know exist within our various systems. To further complicate matters, we are battling a housing supply crisis. And with loss numbers reported, it can often feel like we are walking up a down escalator because we are simultaneously losing housing supply to increase incidence of natural disasters. All of these reasons have led us to hosting this discussion today. We know that these issues are not going away, so we must learn to prepare as best we can and help prevent people from losing their homes. Soon we will hear from our panelists with expertise on navigating disaster preparedness and recovery and how we can better help our neighbors who are impacted by disasters. Our conversation today will be moderated by Stephanie Gideby-Jenkins, Vice President of Strategy at Communities First Fund. But before we get into our panel, I am very appreciative to hear opening remarks from someone who's been working tirelessly on this subject throughout her career, the current Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary at HUD. It is my privilege to introduce Marian McFadden. Marian?
Thank you, Brittany. Hi, everyone. I really want to say thank you for including me in this event. I am always happy to talk about disaster recovery, resilience, and what we can do about the changing climate, but I'm especially happy to be able to do so with NeighborWorks America and with the National Housing Conference, because I have tremendous respect for both entities, having worked with them for many, many years. So I'm really glad we can do this conversation. This is my second go around at HUD. I'm really happy to be able to join the Biden-Harris administration. I've been leading the Office of Community Planning and Development for about 6 months, and I'm really fired up about the work that we're doing and can't wait to tell you about what we have going on, including several opportunities for you to weigh in that are on the street now and that are coming up. Because I think that everything we do at HUD, all the programs that we roll out are so much better when they're informed by the people using the dollars. And I know that includes many of the folks in the audience today. I've actually been working on disaster recovery for more than 2 decades now. So it's been a key focus of my career since September 11th, 2001, when HUD got its first multi-billion-dollar disaster recovery funding through the CDBG program. I've had the privilege to work in HUD in multiple offices, including the legal office, the Hurricane Sandy Task Force, and here in CPD, and the Office of the Secretary. So I've seen the work from different vantage points. And I think part of what's made me successful is always trying to be a good listener to communities who are impacted and using the dollars and trying to do what Congress provides them for. If you don't know too much about the Office of Community Planning and Development, we have annual and competitive funding that we provide to address homelessness, for community development, and for affordable housing preservation and production. And that includes both single family, multifamily, renter, and homeowner housing. We get that funding from Congress, but the biggest thing going in the Office of Community Planning and Development is actually our disaster recovery funding. We've had almost $100 billion through the CDBG disaster recovery program. Every single time it's an individual appropriation from Congress, so some folks aren't as aware of that funding until it comes to their communities. So From the federal perspective, I think for too many years, the need to do community resilience was an afterthought. So we would bring money to communities after the absolute worst disasters and then start to focus on stricter rebuilding standards or opportunities to think more broadly about how people were impacted by the disaster that already hit. And not looking forward enough. But we can talk about the statistics all day long about how many terrible disasters are impacting communities. I'll just throw out there that last year the United States experienced 18 disaster events where losses exceeded $1 billion. So communities are feeling it all across the country. People can get overwhelmed very, very quickly. I know I fall victim to that. When you look at the science, when you hear the stories of what's going on in communities. But I try to focus on what can be done and how we can use the dollars we have to think about the future, to prepare for, respond to what we know can be expected. Because in our lifetimes, we've seen a real change in what we should be expecting. I think I don't have to tell anyone in this conversation that because of the work that you're doing. So I just wanted to, before I really dig into what's going on HUD, say thank you. Thank you for the work that you're doing in your communities and for being champions of the work that HUD is doing, because this partnership is just precious to me. Okay, let's talk about HUD. So Secretary Fudge put out an ambitious climate action plan that speaks to actions all across HUD to reduce carbon emissions across the housing portfolio, increase the resilience of low-income communities all across the country, and address environmental justice concerns. So the impacts of climate change are impacting people in their daily lives. At HUD, we know that we can't just try to do this after the worst of disasters. We need to take bold steps right now to protect communities and to enable local jurisdictions to have the best available information on how to do that. That's a reason why here in the Office of Community Planning Development, we're requiring our more than 1,200 jurisdictions receiving CPD funds to consider their resilience to natural hazards when they do their consolidated plans. Our rule mandates that jurisdictions evaluate the risks to low and moderate income people that are posed by natural hazards, including risks that are expected to increase as a result of climate change. We encourage our grantees to incorporate climate adaptation and mitigation into their core planning to help address environmental injustice. And we're building our library of climate resources to better support the communities we serve. Got a whole lot of toolkits. I know we're going to have some in the chat. I wanted to mention the Community Resilience Toolkit to help government stakeholders and residents learn about actions that they can take to build their resistance to hazards like extreme heat, wildfires, droughts, and flood. We're working with 44 communities that have opted into specialized technical assistance, and we're building cohorts of communities so that they can really roll up their sleeves and work with these tools and understand how to harness experts in their local communities. I was really happy to return to HUD after 6 years in the nonprofit sector and see how much change had gone on inside of HUD. I was on the outside asking Congress and the White House and HUD and other agencies to make it easier for everyone to access information about their climate risk at the local level or at the address level, and the tools have followed. So for anyone else who was out there advocating for those things, thank you, because it did move the government to try to show up with better information. Also, HUD in providing funding for communities is leaning more into the mitigation. It's really gratifying that we are looking at not just building back to what happened, but to looking ahead to all foreseeable risks. HUD went out there first, going all the way back to like 2006 or 2007 with Midwest flooding, encouraging them to focus on their resilience and mitigation needs, and Congress has followed HUD. So now we see bipartisan Congresses directing that HUD funds be used for resilience and mitigation. So I think we are trending in the right direction. Some of the work that's being done around the country by jurisdictions receiving the CDBG disaster recovery funding include addressing flooding and sea level rise. So people are doing buyouts, acquiring properties in high-risk areas that the owners are ready to move on from, and giving them the assistance to relocate. to a safer community, also doing some relocation of small businesses. We're seeing our jurisdictions focus on better building materials for wind resistance in order to survive the really strong storms that they find themselves facing. Dealing with extreme temperature. We've seen communities doing cool roof programs and building and energy ordinances, adding shade trees, insulating homes, and installing permeable pavements. These activities are so important because while flooding causes the most property damage, extreme temperatures are causing the most death around the country. I know the panel that follows is going to talk a bit about fire resistance and the impacts of wildfire on communities. We've been working on identifying fire resistant building materials and ensuring that our grantees are prioritizing people of modest means when they're constructing, reconstructing, or rehabilitating buildings in the impacted areas. I mentioned one of our toolkits. We also put out a resilient building codes toolkit and webinar series and with a resource page, because we've been getting questions about what could those building standards look like to make things safer. And those enable the reader or the person who's watching the webinar to determine what steps make the most sense for their communities in achieving resilience. What should they be thinking about as the path forward? We've also been releasing activity-specific implementation guides to serve as step-by-step instruction manuals for CPD grantees on how to do specific climate activities, like I mentioned, cool roofs. We've got a whole page set up on the HUD Exchange. So we're really trying to take examples from around the country and lift them up so that other communities can benefit. On the regulatory agenda side, we're also working on several initiatives for public feedback. So we said that we would update the federal flood risk management standards, sometimes called the floodplains rule. The Obama administration put out a rule in 2016 that was later withdrawn, and we went on the record saying we were going to come forward with a new proposed rule. And there we're looking to ensure that when we're investing federal funding in communities, they're going to be able to survive the disasters that are reasonably foreseeable, and specifically with this rule, the risk of flooding. Can't say too much more until it's published, but you know that we are really focused on being forward-looking. Second regulatory item is required under Section 109 of the Cranston-Gonzalez Affordable Housing Act. We have to, along with USDA, jointly consider adopting the latest energy codes for new construction of public housing and FHA insured or assisted housing. The office that updates those energy codes is here in CPD. We believe that it's very, very important to consider building efficiency and resiliency together, because they provide cost savings and improve comfort and health for residents. Becomes even more important across the country with these extreme heat events, whether that's extreme heat or extreme cold, and the cost of energy continues to increase. So with this one, it's actually sub-regulatory guidance. It's a proposed notice to begin the process of adoption of more recent IECC and ASHRAE codes. And like with the floodplain rule, I can't say too much about it until it comes out, but expect to see that soon. It's like a HUD thing we say, expect to see that soon. The last thing I'll mention is that we also have some revisions to the regulations at Part 50 and 58 related to environmental review under NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, Procedure Act, and the related environmental laws and authorities. So there we would describe our environmental review responsibilities for considering climate impacts, advancing environmental justice and decision-making, and ensuring site safety, and eliminating duplicative procedural steps that are within the purview of the agency. The White House Council on Environmental Quality issued their notice of proposed rulemaking in 2021, and so we follow, we're likely to follow the White House rulemaking efforts there. On the front of environmental justice, wanted to mention that we are focused under the leadership of the Biden-Harris administration and Secretary Fudge on strengthening the CDBG-DR program. That's our disaster recovery program, with a focus on equity and forward-looking mitigation. We launched a new post-disaster program called RUSH, the Rapid Unsheltered Survivor Grant Program, Housing Grant Program. This is filling a gap where FEMA doesn't generally reach people who are experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness before a disaster cannot access most of FEMA resources in most cases. So we rolled out a new program to provide resources to continuum of care participants who are serving people experiencing homelessness. So excited about that. It was years in the making to get the statutory authority to do that, but really important to provide extra resources to communities so that the people who need the assistance the most, who face the most hardship after disasters, don't get left behind. We know that people of color and low-income people are more likely to live in areas and in individual homes that are vulnerable to flooding and other climate-related weather events. So we're focusing our CDBG-DR program on identifying opportunities to ensure that their needs are being met better. For the very first time, we rolled out an opportunity for the public to comment on the CDBG-DR program. Because it's not permanently authorized, it's never gone through the proposed rulemaking like a FEMA program or SBA program or even another HUD program. We have put, as I mentioned earlier, tens of billions, almost $100 billion into this program, but now it is absolutely time for folks to provide feedback. Public comment is a hallmark at the local level of the CDBG program, but here we are asking as HUD itself, how can we do a better job thinking about both the formula that we use to allocate funding to communities and the rules that we set for the recipients of funding. So we're asking questions there about equity, about streamlining, about serving people more quickly. That is on the street for just under a month longer until February 21st. So I hope that if you've had disaster impact in your community, or if your organization focuses on doing that kind of work, that you will please, please, please send us your best thoughts on how we can do better with this program. I'd be happy to answer any questions or take any questions if anyone has that, but let me hand it back to you, Brittany. Thanks.
Thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate the updates on what HUD is doing, things to look out for. I dropped the information on some of those comment periods into the chat, so if anyone is interested, they can take a look. Otherwise, thank you very much. And yep, and Stephanie has joined us on screen. I'm going to pass the mic off to her to get us into our panel discussion.
Awesome. Thank you, of course, Brittany and Marion, for your leadership over the years. I also want to just express my deep appreciation to NeighborWorks America and the National Housing Committee for coming together to really have this most timely conversation. I'm encouraged, the National Housing Conference for having this timely conversation. I'm deeply encouraged by the panel that we're going to have today, because in part, we are really centering those who have been living through the challenges that many of you all have, and really having to both adapt to climate change in this moment and really thinking about how we build greater resiliency in our communities. I also too want to echo my appreciation for the work that has been happening throughout the decades for those who have been really having to respond in real time, and also mourn the loss of life because of sometimes the lack of inaction at various levels of government. Today, we will have several speakers, and I'm excited to be able to introduce each of them separately. But just to give you all a snapshot, our first speaker will be Joni Strausman Brandon, who is the Regional Vice President for NeighborWorks America Northeast Region. She's been with NeighborWorks for over 25 years and was instrumental in coordinating the capacity building efforts for national disaster response in both Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. Following her comments, you all will hear from Veronica Beatty, who is the Director of Policy and Research at the California Coalition for Rural Housing. She's been an advocate for sustainable communities and housing justice in California for over a decade on issues ranging from transportation planning to rent stabilization. And then we'll finally close out this conversation with Peter Hanley, who is the executive director for CASA of Oregon, a community development corporation at CFI that has been providing asset building, financing, development opportunities with a focus on equity and community engagement. What we know is that communities, low wealth communities and communities of color experience greater exposure and sensitivity to climate hazard and climate hazard and related economic stressors. This is because of their proximity to many of the climate challenges, floodplain regions, areas that flood easily as part of those pieces, substandard housing, the challenges of insurance rates increases, the drought and agricultural workers who are impacted by many of those pieces, and access to costs and cooling. The other piece that we know is that in addition to being able to actually be in those spaces of vulnerability, it's also the inequities of recovery. What we know, again, is that low wealth and communities of color often face greater challenges in rehousing in the financial recovery post-disaster. That really includes everything from really thinking through the recovery programs designed to restore wealth, to the housing stock shortages and the rent hikes, and really thinking about redevelopment and what that looks like. The other piece that we know is that there is often an unintended consequence because of the climate resilience efforts and anti-displacement strategies that can exacerbate displacement and pressures for vulnerable communities. Our panel will, after sharing some of their thoughts, we will have a Q&A discussion to really highlight some of the challenges that we're seeing. What I will say that is in this season and in this moment this year, this past week marked 2 years since President Biden came into office and signed 2 major actions, really thinking about both this moment and what we may need to ensure that we can all thrive as part of that. One of those major efforts is the Executive Order 14008 on tackling the climate crisis, both home and abroad, and also really looking at how we think about really tackling racial equity and really taking an all of government approach on both of those issues. Here at Communities First, one of the things that we've been really sitting with is how do we really ground both this moment and really plan for what the greater movement may need and being able to respond both to climate and the racial inequities that we see in our communities. And much of that is around a couple of key principles, really thinking about how we invest in the capacity of people in the communities to lead and be part of the solutions, how we really support the self-determination, really prioritizing the opportunities for emergent community infrastructure that is equity driven, and really thinking about how we center those who are most impacted as part of that. Thinking about how you bridge those integrated pathways, because we know that a part of that response will require all of this, whether at the federal, state, or even local levels. And it takes a lot to navigate as part of those pieces. So how do cross-sector leaders come together to promote a more holistic outcome and approach to meeting this moment? And really thinking about the proactive collaboration that must occur that offers both the flexibility and prioritizing the flow of resources, particularly for those who are facing critical systems challenges. And then finally, I would just say really thinking about both the responsiveness and accountability while repairing past harm. And this really kind of speaks to how we leverage the federal resources that Marian talked about, really thinking through how we center, again, those who are most impacted by climate change and the responses afterwards, and being able to center the wisdom and expertise of those who live in space and community. With that, I'll turn over my comments and bring in Joan to talk about some of her work that she's done, both in Puerto Rico and within the Virgin Islands. And I look forward to this most timely discussion. Thank you again.
Hey, thank you so much, Stephanie. Thank you for that. And thank you to the National Housing Conference and NeighborWorks America for inviting me to this conversation. And it's great to see Marian, if you're still listening to us. It's great to have you at HUD, back at HUD, and to learn about all the new legislation and other policies that are being put in place to help with disasters. So I'm going to share a bit about NeighborWorks America's response to Hurricane Maria, mainly in Puerto Rico, what we did, and even more importantly, what we've learned. And some of what I'm going to say is very particular to Puerto Rico and the dynamics there, but they're also applicable to many communities that experience disasters, especially, as Stephanie said, those communities that are already under-resourced or challenged or dealing with social trauma even before a natural disaster like a hurricane strikes. So in Puerto Rico, we found that there were 4 elements that were instrumental in assisting the island in the recovery from Hurricane Maria. And Stephanie touched upon some of these. Number 1 was partnership. Number 2, resources. Number 3, capacity building or building on the assets that already exist. And 4, community building. And I'll talk about each one of those a bit. So first, partnership. As we watched in Hara, as I'm sure many of you did on the news, as Hurricane Maria was striking the island, we at NeighborWorks America were immediately trying to figure out what we could do and how. And communication was next to impossible. And of course, Puerto Rico being an island further complicated things. We couldn't just drive over to see what was happening as we did with Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana or Superstorm Sandy in the Northeast or other disasters. What we did do is we immediately sent funds to our 3 NeighborWorks organizations that work on the island. And then we're trying to figure out how quickly we could get there to help in any way. But we also at the same time started hearing about all of these other mainland entities that were also focusing on helping. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the OCC, the FDIC, the Federal Home Loan Bank of New York, and other intermediaries like Enterprise, NALCAP, the Hispanic Federation, VOAD. Everybody was doing something, and there were lots of disparate and sorted efforts. But we were all doing our own thing. And we said, this is crazy. We all want to do as much as we could for the island, but we were all working in silos. So we at NeighborWorks America called meetings in our New York City office just to share what everyone was doing and to explore ways that we could collaborate and, more importantly, not duplicate our efforts. And this led to a partnership initially with Enterprise, Community Foundation of Puerto Rico, and later the New York Fed joined us. At the same time, the organizations based on the island were forging new partnerships with social service organizations, with health and mental health organizations. And these partnerships and communication were critical. And what we learned is, ideally, to already have these partnerships in place and not to have to scramble when disaster strikes. And this can be part of a disaster management plan. Who do you call in an emergency? When we go to the doctor or with our kids in school, there's always a question, who's the emergency contact? Well, that's something that organizations should have in case of an emergency, in case of disasters. Who can you already mobilize and rely on as you're doing what you need to do in your communities? And as a result of that, following Maria came the earthquakes in southern Puerto Rico, and then more recently, Hurricane Fiona. And organizations were much more and are much more prepared. Relationships and strategies were already in place and much better prepared to mobilize resources and partners. So that was important, the aspect of partnerships and knowing who you can rely on. Nextly, resources. Obviously, resources, mainly financial, are needed immediately to help communities. In Puerto Rico, as you probably know, back then, funds were not flowing from anyone, from the federal or local governments. Our NeighborWorks organizations and nonprofits in Puerto Rico were basically first responders after Maria hit the island. They were in their communities before FEMA, before HUD, before local governments. So NeighborWorks America provided $100,000 to each of our 3 NeighborWorks organizations, and they used it mostly to purchase basic necessities for people in their communities, household goods, furniture, food. And further down the line, we provided funding for capacity building, which was the next key element to disaster response. So capacity building or building on existing assets. Even though the nonprofit community development organizations were the first out in their communities, they were not the first to be thought of by their local government or the national government when it came to figuring out how the billions of dollars earmarked for Puerto Rico recovery would be divvied up. One of the reasons given for that was that the nonprofits, so it was said, lacked the capacity to disperse the funds and be stewards of the funds. So in response, we held a full-day workshop in Puerto Rico and invited Vivienda, which is the Puerto Rico's housing department, to share what their plans were in Puerto Rico's recovery and how they plan to use the funding they would be receiving. We also had a panel of mainland organizations from Florida, Louisiana, and New York City who explained how they partnered with their local governments for recovery in their communities and how important and effective that partnership is. And it just reinforced the important role nonprofits play in their communities before disasters, during disasters, and after disasters. We then developed a nonprofit leadership and capacity building program in partnership with Enterprise Community Partners, the Community Foundation of Puerto Rico, and the New York Federal Reserve. 5 nonprofit affordable housing organizations and 1 organization focused on small business development were selected to go through a 9-month program that included training, mentoring, operating grants, and grants to hire technical assistance consultants. We also provided a workshop for board members of the organization. Now that the CDBG-DR funds have finally started to flow after all these years in Puerto Rico, these organizations are in a better position to apply for and get those funds, and they have. Some have started new programs and almost doubled their staff size. And we also partnered with Enterprise to provide a series of webinars in the Virgin Islands centered on risk reduction related to hazard mitigation, the explanation of CDBG-DR funds and CDBG mitigation funding, and health and housing, again, all for capacity building. And finally, community building. There was a report that came out in October called "But Next Time, Storm Survivors Demand Overhaul of Disaster Recovery Systems." And in that report, they talk about worst and first communities. And they define those to be the same communities that are hit by disasters over and over. They are located in geographically vulnerable areas, disproportionately affected, and have a harder time recovering. Puerto Rico certainly fits that description. And it became clear from organizations on the ground in Puerto Rico that they had to do more educating and organizing of residents, so they are better prepared for disasters and more equipped to manage the aftermath, including making sure their voices are heard. In that vein, a few of the organizations we funded started to provide workshops in their communities, some very practical, how to better stormproof their homes, or how to find needed assistance from food pantries to mental health services. Once immediate needs were covered, they have begun to provide a vehicle to bring residents in front of decision makers. In 2018, we began to plan to have a community leadership institute that NeighborWorks America does for residents and community leaders across our network. It includes workshops and plenary sessions around community engagement and action planning, and we were planning to have that in 2020 in Puerto Rico. But of course, that plan got derailed with COVID, but planning is back on, and we hope to have the event in June of this year. The people most affected by disasters must have a voice in disaster resilience, preparation, mitigation, and recovery. As the But Next Time report perfectly states, disaster survivors are the experts on disaster recovery and must lead change. Communities that have survived disasters know what is wrong and how to fix it. So thank you again for this opportunity to share our experience in Puerto Rico. And I'm now going to turn it over to Veronica, who will share their work in California.
Thank you, Joni. I'm Veronica Beatty, the Director of Policy and Research at the California Coalition for Rural Housing. The California Coalition for Rural Housing is a statewide member-based organization that represents developers of affordable housing and housing justice advocates. We work on policy, we do research, and we provide technical assistance to rural communities throughout the state to promote and preserve affordable housing and sustainable, healthy communities. Rural California has always been disproportionately subject to natural disasters because of a detrimental lack of physical infrastructure, historic under-resourcing, lower levels of staffing and capacity in local governments and community organizations, geographic isolation, and incredible spans of defensible space. And our developer members have seen in recent years with the wildfires, as mentioned earlier, loss of properties, communities that have seen loss of lives. And so we've had to really dig into thinking about disaster recovery and also planning and resilience. And in a state that's already experiencing the nation's greatest housing crisis, the loss of housing in disaster affected communities has been debilitating. Disasters have a multiplier effect on the affordable housing crisis by creating direct displacement due to reduced housing supply and housing costs driven up by new demand. and making it harder for low or fixed income residents to find adequate and safe housing that echoes into surrounding communities. And we know that fires are likely to continue destroying affordable homes in our state. Across California, there are 140,000 units of affordable housing in that wildland urban interface that are vulnerable to fire. In some of our northern counties, nearly 100% of our affordable housing stock is in that high fire zones. So we know that the communities we're working in have some of the greatest affordable housing needs, are relying on housing stock that's under threat of destruction, and despite being the most impacted by natural disasters, are oftentimes the least prepared to prevent, respond, and recover. And at the same time as disasters are exacerbating this affordable housing crisis, disaster preparedness really isn't being taken into account when we're thinking about our funding programs. And having truly resilient housing is often difficult and expensive for our developers to deliver. Only one of our state funding sources acknowledges the connection between natural disasters and affordable homes, but our developers face difficulty and increased costs in insurance markets. We've seen major insurers back out of entire areas. We're seeing increased construction costs as our developers try to use resilient building materials and techniques. And so while these costs are being driven up, we already had inadequate funding to meet our affordable housing need, and that's just becoming worse. So I like to come out to these panels and talk about how meeting our existing affordable housing needs is really a disaster preparedness strategy because it makes communities less vulnerable. We see that at the most obvious in case of disaster when we're trying to evacuate folks who are living unsheltered. It's much easier to evacuate people who are already housed. It's much easier for people who are living in an affordable home to spend money on making sure that their household is prepared in case of a disaster, to have a working car in case they need to evacuate. And what we've seen in recent years is that our affordable housing developers can be really valuable partners in all stages of the disaster process. They're already accustomed to navigating really complex funding programs, to layer different sources of public money to make projects work. They're used to thinking about and adapting to meet the needs of our most vulnerable community members. And they serve as anchors in communities. They can provide physical space to stage relief efforts, to host cooling centers or warming centers, provide places where people can evacuate to. And they're also often engaged in all kinds of different levels of local government already and have some of the partnerships in place that can make recovery more streamlined. So as our previous panelists mentioned, disaster planning and recovery has to prioritize the needs of vulnerable populations. And we need recovery strategies that accelerate the ability to provide both temporary emergency shelter and permanent affordable housing. So the way we've seen our communities respond, our developers respond as they begin to build and design for hazard mitigation and resiliency, they're considering 4 different domains. They're thinking about location, design, construction, and operation. Location, because they want to avoid or adapt to different hazard areas like floodplains or that wildland urban interface. Design, as they consider construction materials using fire resistant materials or thinking about ingress and egress in different buildings, the number of residents per floor, stairways per resident, and also evacuation routes and access roads for emergency services. Those construction efficiencies can also look like earthquake fortification, of course, because we are still in California, and water efficient appliances, drought resistant landscaping, considering sinking deeper wells in some of our drought affected communities and helping residents who own their own homes layer public money to do that. And then operations considerations like contingency planning, conducting disaster mitigating maintenance, like maintaining the land surrounding their buildings to reduce fire hazard, and proactively building those relationships that Joni spoke to so elegantly, making sure they're in contact with their local emergency services offices, making sure they have that those contacts on speed dial. And at CCRH, what we're trying to do is host cross-sector conversations so that folks who do disaster planning are familiar with the affordable housing industry, and that our affordable housers are kept up to speed on what's cutting edge in considering disaster mitigation. We collect and publish case studies from our developers to talk about their responses, including those siting choices, building material conversations, construction codes. I'll drop a link to our guidebook on disaster planning, and that includes many case studies from our developers who are dealing with all kinds of different natural disasters. And we also have to engage at thinking statewide about harmonizing our planning and regulatory landscape so that we are coordinating our affordable and fair housing plans with disaster preparedness and recovery plans. Because if we aren't intentional about how we plan to build in advance of disasters and rebuild in their wake, we can continue to exacerbate community inequities and limit housing opportunity for low-income people and people of color. I think we've seen a remarkable response from our affordable housing developers and from starting to think in this kind of cross-sectoral way, but I think we have a lot more work to do, and that's why I'm so glad to be here today talking to all of you and with these experts. And with that, I will turn it over to Peter Hanley, the Executive Director of CASA Oregon.
Thank you, Veronica. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Peter Hanley. I'm Executive Director of CASA of Oregon. We're a nonprofit that for the last 35 years has focused on affordable housing and community facilities development, primarily in rural communities and primarily for farm workers. We are a NeighborWorks organization. We're also a member of the Rock USA family, helping to convert mobile home parks to resident ownership. In 2020, some of the most destructive wildfires recorded in history hit Oregon, destroying 3,000 homes, displacing 10,000 people. In September of 2020 of that year, the Alameda fire in Southern Oregon destroyed a swath of housing from Ashland up to Medford, taking out 2,500 homes, 18 mobile home parks almost completely destroyed, 1,700 manufactured homes destroyed, many of those occupied by farm workers and other low wealth folks. And many of these folks are still living in motels, RVs, and in FEMA trailers. So we're 2.5 years past the disaster, and we're still trying to recover. Now, CASA's role in most everything we do is as an intermediary. And in that role, we really rely on the community to come together and to tell us what they need. This is happening right in the middle of a pandemic. And so our ability to organize is obviously limited. Trying to organize in a disaster over Zoom is not the easiest thing. And we wanted to tread very carefully. As a white-led organization that serves primarily communities of color, we want to be really sensitive to the folks in those communities to be able to make the decisions that will affect their recovery. We're 200 miles away from this disaster. And while we had developed housing in the area that was destroyed by the wildfire, we also wanted to be sensitive to what the reconstruction efforts would look like. So we began by contacting some of because we serve mostly Latinos, we were looking to identify the Latino-led, the Latino serving organizations. And as we started talking with folks, it became very clear that if we were to focus on recovery, because that was really, we were not looking at trying to do anything for immediate needs. We were really focused on the longer term recovery efforts that were going on. And so we decided that our role as an ally to these organizations was to help raise funds. And we contacted many organizations that had done disaster recovery to identify what should we be doing first. And it was clear that we needed to understand who the folks were that were impacted. And so raising money to be able to do a survey, housing needs assessment of the folks was really important. And we wanted to make sure it was a participatory action response so that it wasn't people coming in from outside, but it was actually people within the community that are designing the survey, that are administering the survey, that are making sure that the survey that was done, it really speaks to the people that were impacted by this. And so we really focused on making sure that that could be done. And what happened was we ended up we didn't end up establishing, but the community ended up establishing a new organization that really focused on foundational issues of community building and community engagement. And that survey was the first effort to understand what it was that people want, because they didn't just lose their housing, they lost their community, they lost the connections. And so they wanted to make sure that the survey and however they restored the community really clearly identified what they had lost. And so they got a really good picture of those connections that were in the community, the social fabric, the lost equity in housing, as well as lost equity in work tools, and the community assets that were lost, so that they could really understand it. And since this community, a majority of the women were working it, really they looked to the impact on women within that community. And so our role is trying to work adjacent to this group, doing the fundraising, talking to the dominant organizations, and trying to get them to understand that we've got a community here whose voice hasn't been heard, and how do we give them the power? And so I had some very hard conversations with some of the leaders of some of those organizations, and asking that they either step back or step up in a way different than they had, make sure that we could ensure that the power was being given to those residents. And so the survey was completed. It's being translated right now because we want to make sure, I know it's 2.5 years later, but they wanted to make sure that they got this right. And so they're just now translating it into Spanish. They'll be coming back to the residents to present that to them, and then present to the legislature, make sure the legislature understands as they're doing these rebuilding efforts, it isn't just providing money for refinancing housing or refinancing a community building, but really it's about trying to make sure that the community is made whole. And so as we've been working down there, because our role is also as a developer, one of the communities where a lot of the survey work was done was in a 91 space mobile home park. And so that mobile home park has now been purchased, and our intent is to bring it back and convert it to a resident-owned community. So not only will they own their homes, they'll also control the land beneath the homes. So our goal in our mobile home work is to really democratize the efforts of the community to take advantage and to be able to really determine what their future is going to be. We're also working on rebuilding a farm worker, or building a new farm worker project in the area that will serve 35 farm worker families. Throughout all of this, because of our role as an intermediary, really been trying to focus on how to make sure that state and local agencies are doing their community engagement. So if we're talking language access, if we're talking, and whether that's at public hearings or language access when the state is producing documents to encourage people to take advantage of programs, making sure that the languages that people speak are being made available. We're constantly hammering on community engagement, making sure that community engagement is built in to the programs that have come about as part of the recovery. Our state housing finance agency has begun to allow community engagement as part of the design process for rebuilding some of these projects. And so that's been a real plus, so that we can not have to bury it into some architectural fee somewhere or fund it out of some other line item, but to really understand that community engagement is a key piece to making sure that we design the projects in a way that represent the folks that want to live there. So, in conclusion, I think the key things I learned was, how do I be a good ally organization given my role as an intermediary? So how can we all stay in our lane and really, provide the services that will best be served in a disaster. For us, it was advocacy, it was fundraising, and now it's housing development. And if we're able to, bring that to the table and ensure that it really is a community designed, responsive to community needs, then I think we've done our job. And with that, I think I'll conclude my comments and look forward to a robust discussion.
Thank you, Peter, for your remarks, and all of the panelists for just their honest and thoughtful reflections of how they are both seeing this moment and bringing in their full experience. We'd like to open up the conversation for questions. I have a few that I was hoping to bring into space. If Joan and Brittany and Peter, if you all could join me on video for us to maybe chat a bit about your own experiences and being able to navigate just the realities of the climate implications that we're experiencing. That would be great. I'm going to actually start the questioning with you, Veronica, really thinking about policy changes in this moment. And one of the things that I'm sitting with is just really what policy changes do you feel are needed to make disaster resilience and recovery more equitable for disproportionately impacted communities? I think that you elevated some of just the challenges of what happens when a community may face a disaster.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can't be stressed enough that real robust community engagement needs to be a part of every stage of the process. And that includes things like Peter mentioned, language, poorly translated evacuation warnings that made it so that residents were less likely to get out in time if they were receiving warnings in Spanish, just because they weren't clearly translated. So that's really key. I think it's also important to think about when we focus on recovery dollars, making sure that we are reaching lower income renters and residents of affordable housing, but oftentimes recovery resources are targeted more towards homeowners who absolutely are affected, but they don't reach down to the folks who are renting. And even to unsheltered folks, it's often really difficult for people without a fixed address to receive any kind of recovery assistance at the federal level.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah.
No, please.
And finally, I think to that point, like making sure that we have the financing mechanisms in place to help people as quickly as possible. So if we're seeing delays in federal funding, having some kind of emergency bridge loan fund at the state level, or making sure that we have CDFIs in place to do lending and really get that rebuilding process happening as quickly as possible.
Awesome. I think just wanted to also make sure that if there were any thoughts from other panelists that I could bring their voice into space for this question in terms of just policy recommendations or changes. Okay.
Well, I think we know with the CDBG, the changes that are coming forward, hopefully it gets to be a permanent appropriation, so we're not having to appropriate every time the disaster hits. We heard from Joni, money's just starting to flow, many years after our disaster. We're not going to see CDBGDR probably for, maybe another 6 months. And so I think, at the federal level, obviously it's good to see the changes that are coming. I think of some of the things at the county level and city level where, there hasn't been much disaster planning done, and, seeing some real efforts in the state of Oregon to start remedying that. And, nothing like a good disaster to help people start thinking about what changes they need to make. So.
Yeah, one of the interesting facts is that 4 in 10 Americans live in a county that was impacted by a climate disaster last year. And that when we think about just like the climate related extreme weathers and the increased frequency that we're seeing and the ferocity in which it's impacting people, just that notion of really being able to put some plans in place are critical, and like to not really in some places rebuild back the same. One of the things that I will put in the chat that might be helpful for those who are thinking about this moment and also thinking about some of the federal funding that might be available is a few of the ways in which the Biden administration has been trying to really tackle climate change, and really thinking through some of the key actions that they've done on really thinking about resiliency as part of that. One of the challenges, though, sometimes in being able to have the engagement around multiple government entities is also just the challenge of navigating the bureaucracy. And so I was hoping that maybe Peter and everyone else, because I think, Joni, you really spoke to that and just the lived experience from Puerto Rico, really thinking about the opportunities and also the areas of growth for folks who have to really navigate what it looks like working with various government entities from the federal, state, county, local, when managing a disaster response, and what are some of the benefits and drawbacks from the multiple resources that could be made available, and then really thinking about how you navigate through the bureaucracy and figure out who's responsible for what. It sounds like you had to do a lot of that, Peter.
Well, indeed, and that was one of the first things as I was observing from afar. And remember, I was just focused on recovery, so I wasn't looking at the immediate needs. And there were, new nonprofits popping up. There were all of these folks coming down there, but there was nobody overseeing all of this stuff. So it was really hard. I remember calling the governor's office and saying, find somebody to come down and direct the traffic. The state government has their emergency management plan where, each department does, what they're supposed to be doing, but there's nobody coordinating on the ground. And it took a real long time for people to finally figure out, kind of going off into their own areas, that there was never anybody down there to really direct the traffic. And that was, more just the state and local. I was not paying attention to what was going on with FEMA, but certainly, hearing enough that because we have a lot of undocumented folks not able to access FEMA, I'm hearing those stories. And so, I think that there was just this need for coordination that I wasn't seeing happening, even though, the state had set up, a system for emergencies such as this.
And if I could just add, certainly, in Puerto Rico, it's further complicated because, what their status is not quite helpful to the situation. They're oftentimes not thought of by the federal government. They are a commonwealth, they're not a state, for better or for worse, whether, but so that made it even more complicated. And honestly, I don't think the local governments in Puerto Rico were prepared for the level of devastation and how to respond to it. And of course, having to wait for the federal government to do whatever they needed to do before they could do anything. So it's still challenging. It's been challenging. It's better now, but it's been very, very challenging.
One of the ways in which I first had to experience the impact of climate change personally was after Hurricane Sandy, when it hit the New York and New Jersey region. And I had the privilege of serving as the New Jersey Director for Public Engagement as part of the Hurricane Sandy Task Force. And it was the first time that the federal government really created a coordinated both structure to go across agencies, but also working with each state, asking for a point of contact, as you talked about, Peter, who was coordinating across their state agencies because of the ways in which the federal funding was flowing. And there were a lot of lessons learned through that experience. There was also a two-way channel that was happening in real time, really thinking about a lot of the coordination of the federal funds and also some of the challenges that were emerging in real time and having to report back out to the agencies and really kind of think about some of the rules that were being put out in real time and what they were saying in terms of the guidance that was required and being able to address the challenges that were happening. I think that there have been a lot of lessons learned since the Hurricane Sandy task force over 10 years ago, but there are also things that still remain to be seen in terms of just really thinking about how we also support that coordination at every level and really make it as plain for folks who are trying to navigate it, especially when you find yourself in the cycle of the disaster and then shortly after into recovery and thinking about how to really rebuild in a more intentional and equitable way. Veronica, I was hoping that maybe you could talk a little bit more about the lessons that you've learned from your disaster response experience that contributes to just resiliency efforts more broadly and being able to have this conversation.
Yeah, I think it became very obvious there's a need for a lot of creativity. And I think that's something our sector has in spades, but with climate change creating such diverse and worsening different kinds of disasters, that might look like planning for things that you didn't expect to have to plan for on a particular site. We've had developers who've put their whole property up on stilts in anticipation of flooding, having boat evacuation in place, and any of those evacuation plans need to be informed by residents, whether that's prospective residents who can weigh in on where a staircase should go or the best place to put doors, or existing residents who are going to have the best feedback about how they want to hear about emergencies, what the best way to reach people quickly is. Those plans need to be practiced, not just sitting on a shelf somewhere. There have to be drills so that everyone's familiar and can react quickly. And our organizations themselves need to be thinking about disaster planning for their own organization. So are your documents stored in some place that's safe from fires, safe from flooding? Do your own staff have an evacuation plan, not just your residents? And there has to be a lot of creativity when it comes to partnerships. So in the wake of disasters, we saw some members who got water donations from corporate sponsors and had staging areas for residents and community members to pick up fresh drinking water, or coordination with local schools to deliver free and reduced lunch, again, both to their own residents, but also to the broader community, because these affordable housing developments really are the hearts of their different places.
A question from the audience that I wanted to also elevate to the group to answer was just that the reality is it is safe to say that all communities will be impacted, unfortunately, by climate change in some way, but some are at much greater risk of frequent flooding, hurricanes, fire, and other disasters than others. Is there risk that resiliency investments made via the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, or future funding initiatives, will it be a waste if targeted to communities that are trying to rebuild in place and in areas that are not viable for habitation in the coming decades?
Boy, that's a great question. I think about some of the mobile home parks that were destroyed, that were, in floodplains that were having to be redeveloped down in Southern Oregon or not developed at all. As we start to see these infrastructure investments coming along, are these, and I'm thinking of smaller towns, smaller communities, ready to update their codes to consider this question that is before us. I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, the capacity of these small towns. We've got a housing disaster already before these disasters even happen. How do you? They don't have the capacity. So I don't know how to answer that.
Yeah, and I think I don't either. I don't have the answer either, but I think the unfortunate thing, as we all know, obviously those folks who in communities where there are greater means to begin with, or people have more options in terms of whether they're going to rebuild or leave. Again, the communities that we're talking about are so under-resourced to begin with for the most part, and options are so few. So, what can be done? That's a great question. And, do you encourage people to stay if it can happen again, and are the resources to help them stay that more privileged communities have to be able to have those options and make those decisions. It's a tough one. It is a tough one. I know a lot of people, I mean, someone else asked in the chat, in the Q&A that I answered, have people left Puerto Rico for the mainland? And the answer is yes. Many have returned, but many have said, I'm just going to stay on the mainland. So it's a tough question. Absolutely.
Also just want to bring into space, Cody has shared kind of resources that HUD has been able to share in terms of a guidebook, specifically for really being able to help to get ready for, respond to, and recover from disasters. So please check it out. Going back to the question, I think something that I'm seated with is who honestly will have that final say. When we really think about many of the places that we're talking about, it's not just a place, it's where people live, and there is so much attached to the story of why and what home feels like for them and what brought them to space. And I think it's something that as we went on the shores during my time on the Hurricane Sandy Task Force, I'm a Jersey girl at heart, and seeing how Mother Nature had destroyed the Jersey Shore and seeing how our region was just not ready. Like, for as much as we had watched what had happened each year in the Gulf, for as much as we were seeing kind of the natural disasters and fire pieces happening in the Californias, I think in the Northeast, it was an awakening, at least for me personally, because it really showed that the extreme weathers don't miss any of us. And I think that you're seeing that in the Great Plains with some of the tornadoes. Like, everyone has felt this impact of climate change. And to tell people that they now have to pick up and move feels really hard. But then the other piece that you have to overlay is that many of these places were designed that way. When we think about just the over mapping of the red line maps and who was forced into what communities and what it looked like and what was built around them and what was not put in place to ensure that there was a greater resiliency. This conversation is not enough to just say someone should move, and we're not really looking at the historical impacts. And one of the things that we have really sat with at Communities First is really being able to address that past harm and really being able to acknowledge what had happened. And that a lot of, even just when we think about some of the newer practices to be able to adapt, is not being prioritized in communities of color or low wealth communities. So it's very interesting. And even in the places where people have been asked to move, there are now newer technology that's being put in place to be able to elevate specific homes and what it looks like to be able to protect the shorelines and what it means to do the coast over again. And so it's a very hard discussion without really centering the historical realities of both how a community was formed and forged, who was relegated to many of those places, what it looks like to have that discussion. And so I would go back in answering that question to centering those who live in space. And I think one of the beautiful things that everyone on this panel really spoke about was how they really worked in community with those who had experienced the disaster, but who were also living through it in real time. We often plan for who's coming, but not necessarily who is there right now. And I think the beauty of this panel was sharing what it looks like to do that work in and with community and not necessarily for. And I think that that's often the ways in which we tackle this conversation, is how do we help those people instead of really being able to work in with those who have been most impacted in building. But I will stop my tirade and offer a couple more questions, and please, again, feel free to put it in the chat. Something else that I'm seated with is really thinking about what a community's capacity building and resident leadership efforts had to be able to be put in place to build, and what impact does that have when that's put in place? And I think both Peter and Veronica, you started to speak a little bit more about both the capacity building and resident leadership efforts that you all have been leading.
Yeah, I'll say that some of our developers have really dug in and focused on providing their residents with disaster training and even going so far as to get folks trained up under VOAD so that they are a resource both for their communities at large, but for their building as well. We're also seeing, a lot of trying to encourage our residents to tell their stories as we come into some of these statewide conversations addressing exactly that. Do we rebuild in areas where we know there's going to be wildfire risk, and having folks who can come in and say, this is why this is my home. This is why we can't just write this area of the map off as an unlivable place, and continue that historic underinvestment in this community and in building things that are for me. And similarly, really elevating the voices of tribal leaders, particularly when it comes to forest management in California, right? To say that a lot of the reasons these areas are high wildfire risk are because of land use choices we've made, forest management choices we've made that aren't in alignment with creating a sustainable state. And we have folks who have other approaches. We have tribal leaders who have traditional technologies. We need to be able to listen to them and have that inform how we're managing our forest to mitigate fire risk, instead of just saying, oh, well, we've made this whole area risky, so you can't build housing there anymore, sorry.
I think I would just add, in our organizing efforts right after the fire, as I mentioned earlier, we were treading really lightly because there were existing organizations that, we didn't want to step on their toes, force them someplace where they weren't ready to go. And the new organization that came out of it was young Latina women with an all Latina board. And so, their focus has really been from the lived experience of having grown up in a farm worker community, in a Latina household, in some cases with family members who are members of indigenous tribes from Mexico. And so trying to really, center that piece as they're doing this work. So, I talked earlier about language access, related to Spanish language, but they were working on indigenous language access as well. Also making sure that, as they're looking towards this reconstruction of their community, understanding that this land was indigenous land before the white man came in. And so, how can we hold that reality up and make sure that we're engaging those folks in any sort of reconstruction efforts in these conversations? And so, it's hard. And, we're also trying to, through our NeighborWorks affiliation, give them opportunities for training through NeighborWorks leadership institutes and other activities, so that they can really, find their voices and find their power and really help uplift the whole neighborhood. So it's a great thing to watch. This organization started out with a couple of volunteers, and now they have 4 paid staff. So they're doing pretty good.
Awesome. One of the questions from the audience is also just how can we bring in communities to be part of the solution? Is there a way for youth and residents to be involved and become a resource for their communities? And it sounds like, Peter, that's what you were observing in real time, but could you speak a little bit more to how you're seeing kind of communities being part of the solution?
Well, one of these young ladies, her, who's now the executive director, her real focus has been on the arts and working with youth. And so, that she was doing that work before this other opportunity came along. So, as she's constantly comes to me to seek counsel, being an executive director is hard. And especially a young executive director of a new organization trying to learn all the ropes. How do I help her be the best person she is and still maintain that passion for what she really wants to do, which is, build a cultural center and, have a place for the people to gather that are part of the community. And so, I'm kind of in this role of helping her to, hold that truth, stick with that, make sure that that's always front and center, someday you may not want to be an executive director of this organization anymore, but let's make sure you're still focusing on that, because that's through that work, she's pulling in youth, she's pulling in other folks. And so, just constantly trying to make sure those leaders that are in the community also can continue to access the passions that really drive why they do the work that they do.
Yeah, and I hate to say it, but there's nothing like a disaster to bring people together and mobilize people, and people want to get involved. And in Puerto Rico, once the most basic needs were addressed, I mean, food and shelter and blue tarps and all of that, people realized that they needed to band together and they needed to work together. So again, the nonprofits they have been taking great advantage of it, continue to take advantage of it, of getting out to those communities and starting to organize and talk to people and do some training. Like I said, we're going to do a community leadership institute on the island at the end of June for the residents on the island. So I mean, it's not easy, but it's important, and it's an opportunity. I mean, that's one thing a disaster provides, is an opportunity for getting people energized and involved.
Okay, and I think we're getting to our final question. The only other piece that I would bring into space is that this administration has done some work really thinking about what a climate corps would look like, and really being able to start to build the cadre of the next generation of leaders who can be part of the response and meeting this moment. One of the final questions from the audience that I'll just ask the panelists is that after watching the devastation portrayed following a natural event, why doesn't policy include building to the natural environment instead of business as usual? As in replacing manufactured housing in areas prone to tornadoes, hurricanes, or wildfires. If we are concerned about global warming and the increase in violent storms, why are we still building big homes and using materials that retain heat?
Well, I'll try and answer at least what's happening down in Southern Oregon after the fires. And I think also just in our work of creating resident-owned co-ops, and as we're looking to try and replace some of these old units, making sure that they are well anchored. We don't have tornadoes in Oregon, but we do want to make sure that they're well anchored for the possibility of something happening. In Southern Oregon, it is forcing folks to look at what the design of these units, these manufactured housing units, look like. And so, we're out, seeking a builder right now to replace these 80 units. And, we're making sure that resiliency has been built into the scope that we're seeking for these units. In this community, we also have a whole subdivision that's going to be 3D printed. So, those things are going to be impervious to just about everything. And then we've also seen a number of modular manufacturers bringing some modular units in. And these, are being built to a standard of being able to resist, wind and heat events. And then finally, we're also seeing some folks that are looking at, light gauge steel construction and different construction types and methods that can be used for, making sure that if we're going to build, we're not going to do the same dumb things again.
And I think if I were to answer the question, I think it's also a head and heart fight that's happening in real time. This should be simple, right? Like, we shouldn't be building in the same ways that we have in the past. And yet we are creatures of habit, and we like things a certain way. And it will require, unfortunately, maybe the loss for folks to really see what this conversation needs to be. I think that there have been folks who've been on the front lines having this conversation about our decisions related to climate impacts and implications, and sometimes a lack of accountability at the most corporate levels for what that could be as part of the conversation. But What I will say, even going back to some of the conversations around solutions, is really when you do ground it in community, what you do find is that there have been stewards of the land for generations. And you really see it in both the indigenous and native and community practices, particularly in communities of color and indigenous groups, who are some of the most resourceful folks with limited funding opportunities, and yet have been able to manage some of the hardest crises that our nation has placed before us at times because of our own decision making. And as a result, I do believe that they will be also part of solving for this, but it will also require greater agency from those who are empowered to be willing to make different decisions. And there is a accountability that will be required by all of us to be able to ensure that at every level of government, we are holding folks accountable to what that might look like so that we can have different solutions in meeting this moment. And with that, I think we have our final question to really just do a closeout around just when we're considering other disasters, whether it's tornadoes, flooding, snow, are there any lessons we know that can be applied across the board for all disasters? How specific does a response need to be to the nature of the disaster? And this is for everyone, Joan, Veronica, Peter.
Well, I think, there are some responses that are going to be very specific. A boat is not going to help you out in a fire. But I think when you look at the social vulnerability index that the CDC puts forward that kind of gets factored into thinking about how vulnerable a community is to disaster, a lot of what's going into that are issues completely unrelated to natural circumstances, right? It's about making sure that people have a safe place to live already, decent housing that's not overcrowded, have a good job, have access to a vehicle. A lot of just regular social ills can contribute to vulnerability to disasters. And so dealing with those economic justice issues and building the civic fabric before, during, and after a disaster can help communities be more prepared without us having to get into the nitty-gritty of, how to build a specific building out of fire-resistant material.
Yeah, I think for me, a couple of things. One, as I cited in that report, it's first thing is listen to the people who have been through disasters and ask them what they've needed and what would work for them. And then, try to put the policies and the resources and everything in place to make that happen. But also, to the extent possible in communities, have a plan. Who are your partners? Who's available to you? Depending on what you need. There's always needs, and you can't always plan for everything, but to the extent that you can, to have that disaster management plan at a minimum, who else you can rely on in those times.
I think everything I've heard here is exactly what I would say and agree with. And I guess I would encourage the government to make sure that they're funding community engagement and community organizing. Things that are the hardest things for us to do and can be the most expensive. So thank you.
Amen to that, Peter.
Stephanie.
Okay, I'm sorry, that part. I just wanted to say thank you all for your time and bringing in your lived experience in doing this work. I also want to just thank the organizers, and I also wanted to just do a special shout out to the Organizing for Resiliency folks, in part because Joni referenced their report. Many of the groups who are part of what is a sister organization to us have been really thinking about this moment and what it means to respond. And it's a lot of the folks who have been impacted by disaster response throughout the years, bringing their lived experience into space. So if you haven't, please check out the report that Joni's referenced, which is in the chat as well. And with that, I'll turn it over to David to close this out and help us to ensure that we're in a better place.
Oh, wow, that's a tall order. I can do one of those. Thank you all. This was such a fascinating webinar and so important. We just can't think and talk about this enough. I wanted to particularly recognize everybody at NeighborWorks who we've worked together with all year on these webinars. And I want to note special thanks on our team to Brittany Webb, our new Director of Research. And then finally, just very quickly, we are having a really interesting conference coming up. The Solutions for Housing Communications, going to be at the National Press Club on March 15th. And this is the really only nationwide conference of housing communication leaders from around the country. I think it's going to be really fascinating this year in particular. And finally, last but not least, if you're not a member of NHC, you can join nhc.org. We have all kinds of different levels of membership, from organizational to individual. Our Young Leaders in Affordable Housing program is only, or Emerging Leaders in Affordable Housing program is only $50 a year. We have individual memberships, and we also have group nonprofit memberships for just $1,000 a year. So please check us out at nhc.org. And thank you again, everybody, for being here, and for all of our panelists. What incredible intellectual capital. Thank you very much.